Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Eloisa Ramos, and we are here today to study the text of A Course in Miracles. And I'm here with my friend Connie. Hi, Connie.
Hi.
And Teresa. Hi,
Hello.
Teresa. Hello. And today we are going to study Chapter 4, The Illusions of the Ego. And we left off on Section 2, which is the ego and false autonomy. Okay. All right, so I'll do the first paragraph. It is reasonable to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. In fact, it is the best question you could ask. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past because the past does not matter. And history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. Abstract thought applies to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal, and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Perception, however, is always specific and therefore quite concrete. Okay. Okay, so the first line, it is reasonable to ask, how could I have ever made an ego? Of course. But it's also saying, look, don't focus on that, okay? Because ultimately the problem is that we are still believing that there's separation, and so if we're making the same error, that's the problem that we need to address, because it can only be addressed in the present moment. Okay, and if we address it in the present moment, we will come to recognize what the answer is to this question right here, how the mind could have ever made the ego. Okay, because basically, what is the atonement? The atonement says, what does the atonement say? That the separation never happened, right? Okay, and our only job as a miracle worker is to release fear by accepting the atonement, which is what is true. Okay, there is no separation. And the way we do it is through forgiveness, because unforgiveness, holding a grievance, is really believing that we can be separate from someone else, that we can be at conflict, and therefore that fear is real. So we have made up a separate ego identity when we do that. And that's not what we are. So we've made up a false character, a self-image of what we are not. And that's why it's an illusion. That's why the Course calls it illusion, so, or a dream. So let's see. And then it makes the distinction here between knowledge and perception, because knowledge is completely impersonal and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. So knowledge is, it is, let's see, it's without exception. So it's knowing, it's just knowing. Yes, that's what's true. And nothing else is true. And perception is going to be quite specific because that's what we choose in order to be able to perceive separate things that are specific and concrete, and therefore have a form that can be distinguished as a body. Because without perception, we you know, there's no way to perceive differences. There's no way to separate by judgment and comparison. Okay. Okay. So anything else there before we go? Okay. Oh, okay. Connie, do you want to do the next one?
Yeah. Everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, which is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. He also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process that alters both because they were not made by or with the unalterable. It is important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical proximity. Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction. There can be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact.
Okay, is that pretty clear, Connie?
Yes, but you can give your feedback, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, which is sort of what I was referring to. That we believe we are separate individuals. And what makes us a separate individual? What makes us unique and a person that is different and and not the same as someone else. So we've come up with all sorts of ways to differentiate, right? But that in itself, because we've made it up, because I've just defined myself. Okay, so I'm going to define myself by my gender. I'm going to define myself by my national origin. I'm going to define myself by who my friends are and who my friends are not, by my political party affiliation, by, by my skin color, by my cultural traits, by my beliefs. Okay. I'm going to distinguish myself by my beliefs, and I'm going to make those myself. So it's almost as if I am a territory, or I am, I protect that sense of self-image of myself. And, if you notice that there's people that will really get into it when it comes to different beliefs. And it's because they're making their self what they believe. Okay. And the belief level is still the domain. It's the domain of the ego. So if we remember that, it kind of helps us understand the rest of the paragraph, because he says he also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives. Okay, which is equally variable. Okay. So he makes an ego, he makes an image of this self that he perceives to be separate. So I can make an ego of you, Connie, and say, oh, I know Connie, she's da 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 da. And those are going to be my judgments or my interpretations of what I think the kind of person that you are. Okay. And that's in my mind. Those are my ideas. It has nothing to do with you at all. Okay, so so the interaction, and you'll notice that a lot of times the thinking in our head we can actually have a conversation going on with someone that I know, because maybe I disagree with them about something, but I didn't say it to their face. But now I'm carrying it on in my head, and it's like, okay, well, that's because we think that's what it's saying here, is that there's no real difference here in number 4. It's important to realize, let's see. Thinking, number 5, thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction, because a lot of our interaction with the people that are in our lives, or even people that are not, maybe people that we see on TV, or happens in our thinking. And that's why the tapping works too, because all of the tapping is working with the thoughts in the mind, and what we think those people are, and what they have done to us, and what we think we have done to them. Yes, and so number 3, it says their interaction is a process that alters both. And because it's based on beliefs, on what we believe about them and what we believe about ourselves, these interactions can change those beliefs. Okay, so that's why we say that we teach, that what does the course says? It says that everyone is a teacher, and we teach what we believe, and we don't have to be actively in a position of a teaching role to do that. We just do it automatically in all of our interactions. And we think that those interactions are happening between two separate selves, the me that's here and the self that's separate from me, but they're all really just happening in my thinking with these ideas. They're just ideas. So let's see. Yes, and so number 6, there could be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact. So when I observe someone and I say, oh my goodness, that person has a big ego, okay, it's a projection of my own ego thoughts. And I'm seeing it there, but it's not out there. It's still part of my mind. So the out there is still part of my mind. It's still part of my world, maybe we could call it. So I have made this world, and in my world is really just personal and unique and different than yours. Okay. But there's enough similarity in there so that we think that we're actually sharing the same world. But we're not. We're making it up in our own mind because we think we are a separate self that has a private mind and has private thoughts. But then we get all this evidence that that's not true, right? Because we get all these coincidences, and then we get all these incidents, and we're like, oh my God, how did that happen? I was just thinking about you and you just called, So that's kind of like, we think that that's like freaky, but it's one mind, and we have it upside down because we think it's all separate. They're all separate private minds. Okay, is that clear? Anything there? Yeah. Okay. Do you have a question,
I
Connie?
hear the words coming out of your mouth, and it still feels so very abstract.
Does it?
Yes.
Okay, ooh, it's interesting that you use the word feels, though.
I knew you would say that. It seems abstract. It really does seem abstract to get that principle.
That what
there's
principle?
No one there.
Oh, the one mind? You mean that there's no one there?
There's no one there, and yeah.
The best way that I could explain that would be like lucid dreaming. Okay.
Yeah.
So you have a sense that, okay, this is not really my true self. It's a character, and here's all these other characters, and they're all in my own dream that I am making up. Yeah. Yeah. But the important thing is not so much to try to like, grasp it, the abstract. It's really just to recognize, because we have so many. I mean, I think the miracle, the course says that miracles are normal and everyday, because every single day we have experiences of little things that tell us, yes, you are just one mind, right? There's no
This is true.
coincidence.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no
Yeah.
coincidences. Everything is just interconnected. And
Hmm.
and there's just, yeah, I mean, there's if you really are open to it and you really look, open to see that,
Yeah.
you're going to get a lot of confirmation that you possibly cannot have a separate mind from somebody else. Um,
I
let's
think the
see.
problem is just getting too analytical about it and trying to, figure it out with my brain rather than just allowing this process to be. And you're absolutely right. There are miracles all day long happening.
Yes, and the thing about them is that they are so obvious and in plain sight,
Mhm.
that part of the brain that tries to figure things out because it thinks that everything is complex misses them.
Misses them. Mm. Mm.
Yeah. Mhm. Um, let's see.
Mhm.
Because it's a little bit like the background of
Mm.
the background, like the background in the movie, and the attention is only focused on the drama between the characters.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why the course really emphasizes the practice of stillness, because in stillness, you're going to quiet all of the ego chatter that's the drama of the characters. And if you remove that from your, if you not let yourself get distracted by that, then you can just be in a place of stillness and presence. And that's where you can connect to the abstract of just being. Okay. Teresa?
Your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego is made. When you threw knowledge away, it is as if you never had it. This is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. If this occurs in the present, why is it surprising that it occurred in the past? Surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, though hardly to something that occurs with such persistence. But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we were describing our own state of mind, basically, with all the chatter and the attention getting distracted with the complexity and trying to figure things out, and trying to make sense out of what is basically nonsense, okay, in all the drama. And therefore, let's see, we get stuck on the perception of separation and differences and conflict. And that's throwing knowledge away. because we're throwing away the stillness, the inner peace that opens the door to the awareness of the presence of love, which is the knowing of what we are and what God is and what everyone is and the oneness. But and so so it's about shifting the value that we give to all of those processes in our thinking, you know, like the figuring out. Because when you go into figuring things out, you're at a place where you feel you have to take care of yourself and survive and and kind of what's the word? Make sure you're safe based on your own ingenuity and cleverness and all of that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. I get that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what we've done
Yeah.
is we've let go of that state of deep trust
Mm,
and
yeah,
knowing, yeah, that I am safe.
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it says, you know, but do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now. And so it's interesting because, you know, it says that we've gotten so used to using perception, and remember that judgment is dependent on perception, or perception is dependent on judgment. I don't remember which why, but they go together. So so we've gotten so used to that that it almost happens automatically. We just go into judgment and comparison and, you know, all of that, trying to understand how the world works so we can be safe in the world, kind of a thing. But the Course says that we do not need judgment to function, that we can function quite well just using recognition. And that's what the Holy Spirit, that's what the guidance from the Holy Spirit is. It comes through as a recognition, it's as a remembering, as a aha, of course, that's true. Yes, of course, I don't need to be afraid. Of course, I don't need to worry. Of course, I'm taken care of. You know, of course, God loves me. Of course, I'm loving. Yes, of course, I, of course, I am willing to forgive this, you know, because it's my own mind that made it up. So I'm forgiving myself. So,
Mm.
yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So anything there, Teresa?
I think that's good.
That's good. Okay.
Mhm.
I'll do number 4. Think of the love of animals for their offspring and the need they feel to protect them. That is because they regard them as part of themselves. No one dismisses something he considers a part of himself. You react to your ego much as God does to his creations, with love, protection, and charity. Your reactions to the self you made are not surprising. In fact, they resemble in many ways how you will one day react to your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. The question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. Belief is an ego function, and as long as your origin is open to belief, you are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. When teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know God. belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self with a capital S. Yeah. Okay, so that's a really, really good paragraph. So it really kind of clarifies the difficulty we have with letting go of the ego and believing that we are the ego. And it describes it just that like the love of an animal for their offspring. And the need they feel to protect them because they regard them as part of themselves. So it's almost like an appendage. And so to lose that, is really, really uncomfortable. I mean, it's like losing a part of yourself. And a lot of times, I've seen that with clients where that can lead to depression. So when we are really attached to something that is really our sense of ego, to lose that can be very, very distressful. And so you react to your ego much as God does to his creations. Yeah. Let's see. So that's not surprising. And it's just saying, one day you're going to wake up and you're going to recognize your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. And you're going to love them. You're going to, let's see, you're at that point, we will have discerned the difference between the real and the unreal. So what it says is that the question is not, number 7, how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. Okay, because belief is still an ego function. Okay. And so as long as we think that we are what we believe we are, or that we are what we think we are, then that's the ego. That's an ego function. We are defining ourselves through the ego thought system. And as long as we believe that that's how we're going to know ourselves, we're going to be protecting the ego thought system. Because what we're saying is that our origin is open to belief. And therefore, we are not beyond the level of belief. We are not spirit, because spirit is beyond belief, beyond time, because time is a belief too. So we're going to be stuck in the ego thought system because it's an ego viewpoint. And that's why I was saying that once we start defending our beliefs, we are right here. We are believing that we are what we have believed we are. So we are self-defining ourselves as what people call self-creating, which is not creating, we're just making it up. So when teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know God. So once we have undone all of the ego thought system, which is our own made up ideas about what we are, then that's out of the way. Then we will just be merely left with knowing. And so for the ego thought system, the belief that there's another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea that the ego thinking is capable, because there's a slight hint of recognition there that the ego is not the self. So it connects us with our true mind, which is the decision maker. We think that thinking is how we decide things. So we confuse the ego thinking with the decision maker, but that's not the true mind. That's the false mind. And so the belief that there is another way of perceiving, opens up to the idea that, okay, perception is not absolute truth here. The level of belief is not absolute truth. There's the spirit, which is the capital S self. So it opens up the mind to that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. 5, Connie?
Undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though this is anything but true. Babies scream in rage if you take away a knife or scissors, although they may well harm themselves if you do not. In this sense, you are still a baby. You have no sense of self-preservation and are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you most.
Okay.
Yet, whether
Okay, Connie, you left out a word there in
you
line
have
number
no,
4.
let's see, you have no sense of real self-preservation and are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you most. Yet whether or not you recognize it now, you have agreed to cooperate in the effort to become both harmless and helpful, attributes that must go together. Your attitudes, even toward this, are necessarily conflicted because all attitudes are ego-based. This will not last. Be patient a while and remember that the outcome is as certain as God.
Yeah. So, so this is a paragraph that's almost like, very encouraging to the student of A Course in Miracle, because it's saying, this process of really letting go of these ego beliefs can be perceived as painful. Like it said before, if we're attached to them, it can feel like there's a part of us that is being ripped apart, and it's not true, obviously, but then it's saying, well, it's just like a baby who wants to play with scissors. Okay. And so we don't comprehend that the ego thought system can really harm us, not in the sense of harming our true self, but in the sense of the suffering that comes along with the belief that we are this baby, this separate self, that is subject to the effects of what we believe. We suffer the consequences of the cause of what we think we are, or we reap the benefits of peace, joy, and happiness, depending on which thought system we engage or we believe we are. So let's see. You have no sense of real self-preservation, because the survival instinct is quote unquote self-preservation, okay, but it's not real. It's based on believing we're a body, and therefore you are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you. So then we get into needs. Once we think we're bodies, then we think we have all these needs. Okay. And we don't know when to stop. You know, needs are these insatiable little things that, you know, just take over. Um, you know, and then we end up with addictions or things like that. But but number five says, look, if you're a student of A Course in Miracles, you're reading this. Whether or not you recognize it now, you have agreed to cooperate in the effort to become both harmless and helpful.
Mhm.
And the Course does have that beautiful prayer about being truly helpful. So there is that little willingness there already, because if you're taking the time to read this and to study it, there has to be a little bit of willingness there. And so it's saying, you know, yeah, you're going to be conflicted, okay, because you know, attitudes are ego-based for a while, but this will not last. So hang in there and be patient. And remember that the outcome is as certain as God. So it's about, you know, trusting, and hanging in there, and just doing your lessons and doing your forgiveness work, and just doing your best to follow the thoughts that we're given with the lessons, until that becomes the sort of the default, you know, because right now we have the ego thought system as sort of the default, the go-to. Under stress, you know, we default to these past patterns of reacting, you know, with attack and defense or whatever. And now we're having to, you know, undo that and go to forgiveness and love, you know, and choosing peace, instead of, you know, whatever this is, problem, conflict, etc. So the drama mostly.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Number 6.
Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. This is obvious when you consider what is involved. To the ego, to give anything implies that you will have to do without it. When you associate giving with sacrifice, you give only because you believe that you are somehow getting something better and can therefore do without the thing you give. Giving to get is an inescapable law of the ego, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos. It is therefore continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity that gave rise to it. The whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. Self-esteem in ego terms means nothing more than that the ego has deluded itself into accepting its reality and is therefore temporarily less predatory. This self-esteem is always vulnerable to stress, a term which refers to any perceived threat to the ego's existence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anything here, Teresa, that you want to comment on?
Yes, this giving to get thing is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. And it calls it an inescapable law of the ego. Because the ego is fundamentally a scarcity belief.
Yes.
Yeah, because we believe we have separated from God, who is everything. And somehow we believe that we are greater for it, even though we're stuck in scarcity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so we were talking about loss earlier. This is why we experience loss, because if we're giving to get, and it's always how we evaluate ourselves, okay, in terms of other egos. So it's a little bit like a status thing, like a hierarchy of status. So we evaluate ourselves in relation to somebody else. So you say something like, oh, let's see. So say I feel bad about myself for some reason, and then I say, oh, well, I can think of it positive, at least I'm better than so and so. Or, at least I may be whatever, not making, $1 million in income, but at least I can take pride in keeping my garden in my house clean, or something like that. Or the ego will evaluate itself, and that's why it's talking about self-esteem, okay, in comparison to other egos that it perceives. And remember that they're not really out there, they're just ideas in our own mind. So that's why in number 8, it uses the word deluded. Self-esteem in ego terms means nothing more that the ego has deluded itself, okay, into accepting its reality, and therefore temporarily less predatory. So when the ego accepts its reality, it says, okay, fine. So I'm, maybe I'm not in the upper income category. I'm in the middle income, or I'm in the lower income category. Okay, fine. I accept that. And so in accepting its state in comparison to others, it sort of conforms, to that idea of its position in society, and it's not trying to usurp power, from everybody else. So it becomes less predatory. But the self-esteem, of course, because it's made up and it's based on comparison, it's not stable. So it's always vulnerable to stress. And that's where, a lot of jealousy or envy can come in, because we're always comparing ourselves. And if someone else shows up and we judge them as, oh my God, they have everything I don't have, or they have what I'm missing, then the ego becomes more predatory, because it starts it dislikes that person, or maybe even hates that person. It's like it's like I've had people say things like, I used to play guitar with my husband in a choir at church, and I've had people come up to me and say, oh gosh, I'm so envious that you are up here playing guitar, and things like that. Or jokingly, we'll say like, oh my God, that dress looks so beautiful on you. I hate you, like it's a compliment, but at the same time, it's like I can't have what you have. That's completely a scarcity belief. Um, so uh, and number 7 says its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. Yeah, because it's not real. So we have to be able to, project ego thoughts to be able to then believe that they're actually there and real, and then that reflects back to our thinking, and we can say, of course, the ego is real. She has an ego and her ego is bigger than mine, or whatever. So it's almost like a collective, but it's not really collective, you see, because these are all ideas in our own mind, but it seems like it's a collective agreement, okay, of separate parts that are somehow not me, but they are me. So, yeah. Okay. Let's see. Number 7. Is it my turn? Yeah. The ego literally lives by comparisons. Okay. So equality is beyond its grasp, and charity becomes impossible. The ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. That is why the concept of, quote, getting, unquote, arose in the ego's thought system. Appetites are, quote unquote, getting mechanisms representing the ego's need to confirm itself. This is as true of body appetites as it is of the so-called, quote, higher ego needs, unquote. Body appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home and tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind, which has become completely confused about what is really possible. Okay. So this kind of explains a lot in terms of, our behavior. Like I've been I've been noticing when I use the word get and the situations where I use the word get. Like with my grandkids, I'll say, she's like, well, she's going to eat ice cream. And I'll say, well, go get the spoon, or instead of, um, there's a spoon in the drawer or something like that. So I've been trying to kind of notice when I'm using the word get, because it's really a good way to catch myself of when I'm in this sort of body identity of scarcity. Um, and so what I was noticing is that it had to do with territory. It had to do with giving someone permission to come into, because it's in the kitchen. So if I make the kitchen my territory, I'm going to say to the child, yes, you have permission to go enter my holy temple, the kitchen, and take something from there. You see, and that's a scarcity belief, because I'm saying this little piece of space is mine. I'm in charge there. You're not allowed there, but now I'm giving you permission to go in there and take a spoon. uh, and of course, there's no equality there. I'm definitely not seeing the child. I'm seeing the adult, right, who is in charge of the kitchen, and I'm seeing the child who should not be in the kitchen, because who knows what he could do, start a fire or something. So so equality is beyond the grasp of the ego, and that's why the to perceive sameness is really the undoing of the ego. Um, and charity becomes impossible, because charity comes from the recognition that giving is receiving. And to the ego, that's not true. Giving is a loss. So that's why the ego never gives out of abundance, because it was made a substitute for it. And so the getting are the appetites. They're the mechanisms that represent the ego's need to confirm itself as unequal and as separate. So it's making a self-identity in contrast to you. And this is as true as body appetites or the higher ego needs. And you know, most of the time we think body appetites are physical in origin, but they're not, because remember that the body is not causal. So there's nothing that is, the body is not the origin of anything. It's the mind. The mind is the causal projector, the maker, and it's where the thought system is that that is going to change perception if we change our thoughts, our beliefs, our mind. It's also interesting that the idea that that the ego can satisfy itself through the body is also a decision of the mind. And if we believe that, you know, we're going to be very, very attached to the body, because we're going to believe that we cannot do, we cannot not take it seriously. We're going to take the body very, very seriously if we believe that our ego is can satisfy itself through the body, because we're going to pay the body a lot of attention to its needs. So anyway, anything there?
No, I just really love that line. 3, the ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. Yeah, that's something I just highlighted as a good thing to remember. I had, you know, I already had everything and it wasn't enough.
Yes, yes, yes. And so we judged it. Okay.
It wasn't enough. We
Yes.
thought there could be more. But how could that thought have even entered? Well,
we go back to the idea of judgment, and we go back to the idea that what we perceive is not really out there. Okay. And therefore, when we judge, all that we are judging are our own ideas of what we think is out there. So when we're judging eternity and God, we're not really judging eternity and God. We're judging what we think is eternity and God. And we are judging that not good enough.
Yes, and that's where a lot of us stay stuck because and don't want to release the ego because of that. Yeah.
Yes, because we want to hold on to the level of belief as what is true. So we want to say, I believe God is this way. Okay.
Yeah.
And I want to be right about that. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My turn?
8.
The ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. It is not free, however, to open the premise to question, because the premise is its foundation. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. The ego's ceaseless attempts to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are useless. Spirit, in its knowledge, is unaware of the ego. It does not attack it. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. While the ego is equally unaware of spirit, it does perceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional. The creations of God do not create myths, although creative effort can be turned to mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition. What it makes is then no longer creative. Myths are entirely perceptual and so ambiguous in form and characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful connotations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you want to say anything with that, Connie?
No.
Okay. Okay, so this is a really good way to summarize the belief in separation, is that it's the belief that the self, the ego we think we are, is completely on its own. And therefore its origin is anonymous. It just started, with a big bang or something. It just evolved from a little amoeba or something. Okay. And that's I mean, that's science, but there's all these myths about the origin of the human, right? So so basically the idea has no real cause. The idea of the ego has no real cause, and so that's why it's a fearful state. And so it turns to other egos who it perceives as separate, separate selves, separate minds, to unite or attack, because of that fear. So number 3, it is not free, however, to open the premise to question. And the premise is that, oh, I am completely on my own. Okay, because that is the premise of its foundation as an ego. So if I don't ever question that, I will be stuck believing I'm the ego. Which is a little bit like we were talking about before, where we fail to recognize all the evidence that's showing us that we are one mind and not separate minds. Because to start recognizing, oh, geez, I'm not a separate mind, that would be to question the premise here, you see. So the ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own and therefore has a separate mind as a self. Now, number 5 is talking about the ego's attempt to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence. Okay, so what it means is that even the ego doubts its own existence, because if it didn't doubt it, if it didn't have that's where the fear comes from, some sense that because it doesn't know, the ego has no knowledge, so it can never be certain of anything of itself. And so it has to attempt to gain the spirit's acknowledgement to prove to itself that it does exist. But it doesn't work. And a lot of times what we end up doing is we end up trying to reconcile truth with illusion in order to try to make the ego real, to make the ego feel that it does exist. But of course, the spirit is unaware of the ego, because there is no ego. It's an illusion. It doesn't attack it. It just cannot conceive of it at all. Because spirit cannot let's see, because the spirit is not the mind, is not the conceptual mind. The ability to conceive is not part of spirit. That the ability to conceive of concepts is part of the ego thought system. Let's see. And so the ego is unaware of the spirit, but it does perceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. So that if you look at that, that can show up as a sense of unworthiness. That's why the self-esteem thing comes in here. There's a sense of there's something wrong with me, or there's something not right about me. That's that sense of feeling like I'm being rejected, like I'm not good enough. Yeah. And that's why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional, because the self-esteem is there to try to compensate for what it's saying here, this sense of being rejected by something greater than itself. The creations of God do not create myths, okay? And the reason why the creations of God do not create myths, because myths, okay, are fictional, and to create is real. Okay, so you cannot make a myth real. So to create a myth would be to give it reality. And although we try to make the ego real, it's really just a mythology. Yes, so the effort can be turned to mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition, that what it makes is then no longer creative. So that's why the Course distinguishes between making and creating, because creating, what we create as spirit, is an extension of spirit and is therefore creative, just like God created us with creative power. What we make is not creative, because it's not in alignment with truth, and therefore it's an illusion. It's a belief in illusion that truth can be attacked. And we can be therefore sinners, and be able to attack and offend God. So let's see. So myths are entirely perceptual, and so ambiguous in form and characteristic, good and evil, that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful connotation. And so most of the fairy tales, most of the Walt Disney movies are all myths. They're entirely perceptual. Yeah. And they're scary. There's elements in all of them that are really, really scary. And we take kids to go watch them and we read those books to them. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Number 9.
Myths and magic are closely associated, since myths are usually related to ego origins and magic to the powers the ego ascribes to itself. Mythological systems generally include some account of the creation and associate this with its particular form of magic. The so-called battle for survival is only the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is usually associated with physical birth because it is hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. The more religiously ego-oriented may believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist after a temporary lapse into ego life. Some even believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse. However, salvation does not apply to spirit, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged.
Okay. Anything, Teresa?
It's debunking all of religion, basically.
Yes. Yes. Uh-huh.
Saying,
Yeah.
you know what? None of this stuff applies to the spirit because you don't need salvation.
Yeah, it's also debunking reincarnation, right? Because it says, yeah, this beginning is usually associated with physical birth because it's hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. Yeah. So if we are spirit, then nothing has been separate from itself. So nothing happened, basically. And so salvation does not apply to spirit because as far as spirit is concerned, there is no world, there is no body, there is no birth, there is no death, there is no time. So there is no lapse, so there is no ego. Yes, yeah. So all of it is myth and magic. It's interesting that it says that magic. So it says myths are usually related to ego origins. Okay, how we originated as a species, and magic to the powers the ego ascribes to itself. Because the ego, it has no real no real cause. It therefore has no real effects. However, if we believe that the ego is real, then it's going to have, quote unquote, real effects. Okay, and that would be magic. Yeah, because they're not really real. But if we believe in that separated self as the thought system that is causal and makes up the body and everything in the world, then yeah, those are going to be the effects because we believe that the body is real. So it's a real effect. The world is, made up of separate things that are real. That's why we say that what I perceive is reality and it's a dream. So it's not reality. But if I believe it, then I have made it real to myself. Okay, number 10. It's my turn again. Salvation is nothing more than, quote, right-mindedness, unquote, which is not the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit, but which must be achieved before one-mindedness is restored. Right-mindedness leads to the next step automatically because right perception is uniformly without attack, and therefore wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. Its direction is always automatic because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. Okay, so salvation, so the Course talks about the salvation of the world. Okay, and so here it's saying that salvation is nothing more than quote unquote right-mindedness. And it's also distinguishing that from the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit, which is interesting. I think I kind of thought those two were the same, but it's not. It's saying that the right-mindedness must be achieved first before the one-mindedness is restored. And I think what that means is that to be right-minded is a decision to choose love rather than fear, to choose the miracle rather than the grievance, to choose to forgive and have inner peace. So I think that the right-mindedness is it's that little willingness that the Holy Spirit needs to restore the one-mindedness, the recognition of that. Because the right-mindedness, so with our little willingness to see things differently, to forgive, then that leads to the next step automatically, because right perception is uniformly without attack. So it's a choice to not be not be harmful. And therefore wrong-mindedness is obliterated, because the Course talks about attack thoughts. So it's a decision to choose loving thoughts rather than attack thoughts, and to basically not take direction from the attack thoughts. And if we do, then we practice the forgiveness. So we can, so that we're not stuck in the guilt. And so the attack thoughts are basically judgment. The wrong-mindedness is basically, our decision to attack and compare and differentiate and perceive inequality. And that's why the ego cannot survive without it. And if we lay that aside, if we choose to just not judge, not take sides, not, make one person wrong and one person right, if we just choose to forgive it, because we recognize that they're basically both the same, two lefts don't make a right, but that kind of a thing. Then we put our ego self aside, and the mind can now move in the direction of Holy Spirit. And the direction is always automatic because it cannot be dictated by the thought system, because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. So what it's saying is that if we move the ego thought system aside, then the mind will flow and adhere to the thought system of God and be guided by the Holy Spirit. And that's why the Course talks about removing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, because that's all that the ego thought system is. It's like a block that we believe is there. And as long as we believe it's there, it's going to, quote unquote, be there, even though it's not really there. But But because we take those thoughts seriously, we give them power to miscreate. So, and then of course we make the ego real that way. So, okay, let's see. 11.
It cannot be emphasized too often that correcting perception is merely a temporary expedient. It is necessary only because misperception is a block to knowledge, while accurate perception is a stepping stone towards it. The whole value of right perception lies in the inevitable realization that all perception is unnecessary. This removes the block entirely. You may ask how this is possible as long as you appear to be living in this world. That is a reasonable question. You must be careful, however, that you really understand it. Who is the quote unquote you who are living in this world? Spirit is immortal, and immortality is a constant state. It is as true now as it ever was or ever will be, because it implies no change at all. It is not a continuum, nor is it understood by being compared to an opposite. Knowledge never involves comparisons. That is its main difference from everything else the mind can grasp.
Yeah. Anything you want to say there, Connie?
No.
Okay. Okay, so it's talking about right perception. So the correction of perception is right perception, and it is necessarily because the misperception, which is the wrong-mindedness, which is the attack thoughts, are a block to knowledge. Because we're choosing to perceive rather than to know. And so the right perception is accurate perception, and is a stepping stone towards knowledge, towards knowing. And that's the value of right perception. So the value of right perception is not that it's the value of right perception is the inevitable realization that all perception is unnecessary, which is really interesting because we tend to think of the word right and wrong as opposites. Okay. And right perception is not the opposite of wrong perception. Okay. They're both still perception. So they're both still not knowledge. Yeah. And so, but the realization that right perception brings to us is that we get to see, oh, okay, knowledge is really what I'm after as the truth. Okay, so it's not just being right. It's a letting go of both being right and being wrong, and just knowing that there is no difference, there is no comparison, there's no separation, there's no reason to judge, period, because it's meaningless, it's all subjective, it's all just personal, it's all just specific, and therefore how much could that really mean? So yes, so we want to remove the block entirely, which is to recognize that we don't need to trade knowledge for perception. And then of course it says, well, you know, this, how is that possible? You're going to be wondering, how is that possible as long as you appear to be living in this world? How can we it's a world of perception. What happens if we let go of the perception? The world disappears. So it says, okay, but here it is. Be very careful now when you ask this question, because who is the you who are living in this world? Okay, that's not the true self. The you that's living in this world is not the true self, okay? Because the true self is spirit and is immortal. And immortality is a constant state. And therefore it's not in time. So spirit is not part of the time belief, beyond time. Because time is a continuum. Spirit is beyond a continuum. And it's not understood by being compared to an opposite, because spirit has no opposites. And that's why knowledge never involves comparison. So you don't need judgment with knowledge. And the comparison is a big key here. That is the main difference from everything else the mind can grasp. So if we want to understand the difference between knowledge and perception, and we use the word knowledge in the world all the time, and what we really mean is perception, or information. So information always involves comparison, right? So, what is the number 3? Well, the number 3 is only meaningful in relation to comparing, less than 3 as 1 or more than 3 as 5 or 6 or whatever. So all these ideas are only meaningful when we are looking at them in comparison to something else. That's why it's perception. So it's not knowledge. So math is not knowledge. Oh my goodness. Okay, so anything there before we stop? Any questions, Connie? No?
No.
Okay. Okay, so then that concludes the ego and false autonomy. And it's an interesting title there, because it actually did not mention the word autonomy in anything here. Did you guys remember hearing the word autonomy?
No, you're right.
Yeah, but the whole paragraph is about the idea that the ego is on its own, because remember
Right.
it said separation, belief.
It's all alone. Yeah.
Paragraph 8, the ego believes it is completely on its own.
Yeah.
Which is how it thinks it originated. So it's calling that false autonomy.
Yeah.
Because the ego is definitely not autonomous. It's completely dependent on everything else. It's dependent on perception.
Oh,
No doubt.
that's a good one.
Yeah.
It totally is. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. Okay, so next time we'll do the next section here, love without conflict. So, so thank you for joining us. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Connie. Bye.
Thank you.